Hey guys, tonight, we drift into the dustiest, vaguest, and most wonderfully forgettable corner of Egyptian history. You are standing at the crumbling gates of the 7th Dynasty, a stretch of time so unclear that even Egyptologists kind of squint and shrug. The sun is low over a flat horizon, brushing faded limestone with gold. Wind hisses across the dunes like a sigh, and the only real sound is your own soft footsteps over sand and memory. Welcome to the dynasty of, maybe. You won't find towering pyramids here. No dramatic temples. No Rosetta Stone-worthy declarations of conquest. In fact, you probably won't survive this dynasty, not because of war, or plague, or crocodile stampedes, though those are still stylish, but because of sheer soothing boredom. The 7th Dynasty is so obscure, it makes dust motes look famous. And that's exactly why we're here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always read the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the dry bed of a long-forgotten canal, now choked with sand and prickly desert scrub. Ahead lies the remains of a once grand administrative building. Nothing remains but the outline of walls and a curious pile of broken pottery sherds. Some bear faint markings, hieroglyphs scratched like afterthoughts into soft clay. You bend down, brushing at the dust, a symbol for king, another for year. But which king? Which year? Even the pottery seems unsure. That's the essence of the 7th Dynasty. We think it existed. Probably. It's traditionally listed after the fall of Egypt's Old Kingdom after Pepi II's record-breaking reign that lasted something like 94 years, if you believe the ancient sources. Which honestly is a bit like saying your great-grandfather is still running the company at age 105 and everyone's too polite to tell him it's over. By the time Pepi II finally took his royal nap, the central government was a bit crumbled. Nomarch's regional governors had begun acting more like little kings in their own right. Trade routes were faltering, Nile floods were inconsistent. And faith in the Pharaoh's absolute power, well, it had dried up faster than a goat bladder left out in the sun. Into this political compost heap crept the 7th Dynasty. Historians still argue whether it was even a proper dynasty. Some believe it was a string of ephemeral rulers hastily propped up and knocked down like an administrative game of whack-a-mole. Others think it may never have existed at all, a scribal invention to patch a gap in time between better-remembered eras. One ancient source, Manetho, famously claimed there were 70 kings in 70 days, which sounds less like a government and more like a TikTok challenge. Of course, modern scholars don't take that literally, at least not most of them. But it paints a picture of desperate transitions of royal hats being passed around like leftovers. Imagine being one of those kings. You finally get to wear the double crown, sit on the gold-trimmed seat, and command the might of Egypt, and before you can finish your first decree, someone's already etching your replacement's name into the staff schedule. You pass a faded stone lintel, half buried in the sand. There's a name carved faintly, Neferkare something. Or maybe it's Menkare. It's hard to tell. The carving looks rushed, and the hieroglyphs are crooked, like someone did it while riding a donkey over cobblestones. You gently brush it off and wonder, was this the name of a real king, or just someone important enough to get a cartouche, but not important enough to survive the editing of history? This is where things get fuzzy. Egyptologists have found names, dozens of them, in scattered fragments. Seal impressions and inscriptions on tomb walls that weren't even royal. Names like Itimenkare, Neferkare, Nebi, and Nikare. Some show up in king lists written centuries later. Others appear just once, never to be seen again. It's like finding a business card with no job title and a phone number that's out of service, and that's the challenge. The 7th Dynasty wasn't built to last. If it existed at all, it was a flicker in the desert wind, a placeholder, a panicked bureaucratic note scribbled before the ink ran out. And yet there's something oddly beautiful in that. Imagine being remembered not for your victories, but for your absence. Not for monuments, but for mystery. These pharaohs, if they were real, exist now only in half-finished names and awkward silences. In the way later generations tried to pretend they never happened. Even the famous Abydos king, list a royal who's who carved centuries later, skips the 7th dynasty entirely, right from Pepi II to the 8th dynasty, as if those in-between rulers were just erased. It's the ancient Egyptian version of, we don't talk about that era. Some think it was deliberate. Others argue it was just confusion. After all, if you can't even agree on how many kings there were, or whether they had their own crowns, or just borrowed peppies, you might as well skip ahead. But something must have happened. The Nile kept flowing. People still needed bread and beer. Priests still performed daily rites, whether the king was named or not. And in the background, behind the papyrus and prayer history, whispered names no one quite caught. You walk now through an empty corridor roof, long gone just the stone base of columns, tracing a path. The walls are blank. No glorious scenes of conquest, no triumphal texts. Just stillness, a kind of dignified quiet, like a museum closed for repairs. And in that stillness you find space to imagine, to wonder who these kings were, if they were kings at all. Maybe one ruled for a week and spent it fixing irrigation. Maybe another lasted just long enough to issue one command. Build me something small, please. You smile at the thought. Even pharaohs can be forgettable. And sometimes that's exactly what makes them worth remembering. You keep walking, and the sand shifts slightly beneath your feet, soft as sifted flour. A faint breeze trails past your ear, like someone whispering a name you've already forgotten. You're deep into the territory of pharaohs, so brief, so utterly impermanent, that even the gods might have blinked and missed them. 70 kings in 70 days, remember that. That was Manetho's bold, almost theatrical claim. 70 rulers, one per day. It's got a certain absurd poetry to it, doesn't it? Of course, historians still argue whether Manetho meant it literally or symbolically. Did he mean 70 men actually ascended the throne and ruled each for a day like royal speed dating? Or was he just offering a dramatic flourish, his ancient version of saying it was a mess? Either way, the image sticks. A rotating door of kings, each one barely sitting down before someone's already clearing their breakfast. You picture it now, a ceremonial hall in Memphis, dusty and dim. A priest unfurls a scroll and calls out, "Next," and in walks a nervous man in linen robes, clutching a crook he borrowed from his cousin. He bows, signs something, tries to remember the correct posture for royal portraits, and just as he's beginning to feel regal, bam, next guy. It's bureaucratic chaos, dressed in gold-threaded sashes. But why? Why this royal churn? Most scholars agree the instability followed the slow collapse of centralized power after Pepi II. That king had ruled so long that by the end of his reign, everything beneath him had eroded. Imagine a wooden cart with one wheel slowly falling off for 9 decades. By the time someone else takes the reins, it's not a cart anymore. It's a pile of planks tied together with fraying rope. Nomarchs, those regional governors, had grown powerful in the vacuum. They built their own tombs, carved their own names into temple walls, and increasingly ignored orders from the capital. Some may have even declared themselves pharaohs in their own right. Historians still debate whether the so-called 7th dynasty was actually a central authority, or just a bunch of rival territories all pretending to be in charge. In one possible scenario, Memphis became a sort of symbolic throne room, a ceremonial capital where kings were crowned more out of habit than necessity. The real power may have been shifting south to places like Heracleopolis, or even Thebes. Imagine a ceremonial city with dusty streets, sleepy guards, and scribes who don't bother learning the new king's name because they know he'll be gone before the ink dries. You wander into the ruins of what might have been a royal office. It's mostly rubble now, cracked walls, fallen beams, a single doorway leaning just slightly off-center like it gave up centuries ago. On one fragment of wall, you spot a painted cartouche, or the ghost of one. The oval outline is clear enough, but the name inside smudged, half-carved. Maybe someone changed their mind, or maybe the artist just never finished. It's like someone wrote your name here and then wandered off. That's the thing about the 7th Dynasty. The closer you look, the less solid it becomes. Names blur, timelines buckle, and what little evidence remains is often reused, reworked, or found somewhere it doesn't belong. Like a royal name etched onto a stone basin, later repurposed as a trough. Was it originally for rituals, or just a sink you'll never know? And that's oddly relaxing. You find another name scratched faintly onto a piece of limestone near Saqqara Niqare. Some scholars list him as a king of the 7th Dynasty. Others argue he was merely a noble or a scribe who got ambitious with a chisel. Then there's Neferkare Nebi, a name that shows up only once in the Turin king list, which itself is so fragmented it resembles a papyrus piñata. Nebi may have ruled for a day, or a week, or maybe he was someone's cat. The idea that these names might represent actual rulers, ceremonial figureheads, or clerical mistakes is still debated. Some Egyptologists even suggest the 7th Dynasty could be a historiographical invention created by later scribes to make sense of a gap in memory, like trying to fill a hole in a family tree by inventing a great-uncle named Gary, who no one actually remembers. And yet the image of 70 rulers in 70 days refuses to go away. It paints a vivid scene. You imagine Memphis hosting a bizarre royal relay, complete with a ceremonial headdress being handed from one king to the next, like a sweaty baton. The viziers don't bother repainting the wall portraits. They just scribble the new names in the margins. In the temples, priests must have had a difficult time adjusting. One day they're offering incense to beloved of Ra, and by the time the scent clears, they're supposed to pray to Guardian of the Horizon instead. It's exhausting. You picture a priest grumbling as he re-etches yet another divine title into the stone. Can we just go back to worshipping the sun and call it a day? Amid this chaos, Egypt's core still functioned somehow. Farmers farmed, scribes scribbled, beer was brewed and bread was baked. The Nile flooded when it pleased, and villagers adapted as they always did. One of the odd beauties of Egypt is how the civilization endured even when its figurehead spun like papyrus in the wind. You pause beside a broken statue. The face is gone, the torso cracked, but one foot remains bare, solid, confidently planted. It might have belonged to one of these ephemeral kings. Or not. It doesn't matter. The point is that someone stood here once. Maybe for a day, maybe for a moon cycle, maybe only long enough to have their name half chiseled and then crossed out. It's strange, but in the haze of forgotten rulers, there's something almost comforting. A sense that even the most powerful title can be temporary. That being forgotten isn't always a tragedy. Sometimes it's just part of the rhythm, like a rest in a long song, a breath between verses. And so you keep walking past crumbled thrones, unnamed statues, and inscriptions that don't bother with punctuation. You're not searching for facts anymore. You're drifting with the story. The story of the kings who ruled too briefly to be remembered, but just long enough to matter. You arrive at Memphis, but not the Memphis of golden splendor and trumpeting processions. This is Memphis on low power mode. The kind of capital city that's still technically functioning, but mostly out of habit. The stone walls are cracked. Weeds creep through the edges of what once were palace courtyards. A scribe sits beneath a faded awning, not writing anything, just watching dust dance in the sunlight. It feels like a place politely pretending to still be important. You step inside what might have once been a royal audience hall. The columns are stubby and mismatched, as though someone scavenged them from various building projects that never quite finished. A few wooden beams remain half-supported by stone brackets, one of which has the faint carving of a lotus flower, still beautiful even as it peels. There's a throne at the far end. Not grand, not gilded. Just there, slightly crooked. As if the last king who sat on it had to wedge a rock underneath one leg to keep from tipping. You can almost hear the shuffle of feet, the awkward clearing of throats, and a priest quietly asking, "Do we have a name yet?" 'Cause here's the thing, by the 7th Dynasty, even Memphis had become uncertain of itself. Priests still performed rituals, but quietly under dim light, as if unsure who exactly they were invoking. Scribes tried to keep track of royal edicts, but most of those ended up in baskets labeled pending. Viziers whispered about the next king before the current one had unpacked his ceremonial sandals. Historians still argue whether this was a true dynasty with centralized control or a theatrical illusion held together with incense and wishful thinking. Maybe there was a central figurehead. Maybe multiple regional rulers took turns pretending to be Pharaoh for the record books. One fringe theory even suggests it was a sort of royal committee, several leaders governing at once, like Pharaoh roommates who divvied up responsibilities. You handle taxes, I'll do offerings, and someone feed the temple crocodile. You pass a courtyard filled with broken jars and weathered crates. There's a piece of pottery labeled "Property of the High Office," though. Whether that means a real office or just someone trying to sound important is anyone's guess. In one corner you spot a single sandal, worn, cracked, small, maybe ceremonial, maybe just lost in the shuffle of a hasty exit. You're beginning to get a feel for how the kingdom operated on half memory and quarter certainty. There were officials who remembered how things were supposed to work, priests who had memorized rituals passed down from the grand days of Djoser or Snefru. But now they were applying those traditions like a bandage to a cracked wall, hoping no one looked too closely. The inscriptions from this period are telling, if not for what they say, then for what they don't. Many are short, nervous. Some mention a king once, and then never again. Others speak of temples restored in the name of the Beloved One, without saying who the Beloved One actually was. It's the historical equivalent of writing "Dear Leader" and hoping someone else fills in the blank. You make your way into what used to be a scribal archive, though now it's just a room filled with half-burnt scrolls and shelves so warped they resemble melting papyrus. On one wall, etched in red ink so faint it's almost gone, you find the outline of a name, IT. Or is it IT? Maybe it was an abbreviation. Maybe someone coughed while writing. Either way, it's the kind of detail that keeps Egyptologists up at night, magnifying glass in one hand, strong tea in the other. And the best part, there's no king list from this period that clears anything up. The later Abydos king list, which serves as one of the more official who ruled when documents in Egyptian history, skips the 7th Dynasty entirely. Just blink, it's gone. One moment, Pepi II, the next, the 8th Dynasty. No footnotes, no awkward asterisks, like a family reunion photo where one whole branch of the tree has been cropped out for being just too confusing. Some scholars think this omission was deliberate, a way for later dynasties to clean up a messy past. Others believe the records simply didn't survive, or that the scribes were overwhelmed by how fast leadership changed. After all, it's hard to carve a legacy when your king has the staying power of a sandcastle in high tide. Still, even amid the confusion, the city of Memphis tried. You walk past a half-finished temple wall. The carved reliefs start off well-neat lines, clear figures. Then suddenly the details fade. Outlines left incomplete. Faces with no features. You imagine a stoneworker laying down his tools and muttering, "Let's see who's in charge tomorrow before I waste more granite." And yet the system limped along. The temple still smelled faintly of incense. The priests still tracked the stars. Grain was still measured taxes, still collected, albeit with a bit of guesswork. That's Egypt for you, a civilization that continued to hum, even when no one was entirely sure who was steering the ship. You hear the soft bleating of goats from beyond the city walls. Life indifferent to dynasties carries on. A boy chases a runaway jar lid. A woman arranges reeds for basket weaving. Somewhere someone is singing an old song that predates the 7th dynasty by centuries. And through it all, Memphis breathes a little slower, a little less certain, but breathes nonetheless. There's a comfort in this kind of history. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that hums quietly in the background, even as leaders flicker in and out of focus. It's the rhythm of endurance, not dominance. As you step into the waning sunlight, casting long shadows across the broken steps of what might have once been a royal court, you realize something. This city isn't dead. It's drowsy. It's forgotten how to hold a coronation, sure, but it remembers how to survive. And maybe that's all it needed to do. The sun dips low as you leave the lazy remains of Memphis, behind trading crumbling courtyards for a scattering of half-buried stones out in the open desert. You're headed somewhere quieter now, if that's even possible. Out here, far from the walls of the palace, there are fewer signs of pageantry and far more evidence of what could best be described as attempted authority. The realm of names, just names, carved into broken stone, with the hopeful precision of someone who wanted very badly to be remembered. You kneel beside a weather-worn limestone slab. It's small, crooked, and partially snapped along one edge. But right in the center, there's a cartouche. You know, that royal name oval that's supposed to encapsulate power, divinity, and eternal remembrance. This one looks like it was carved during someone's lunch break. The lines are uneven, the hieroglyphs slightly askew, and there's a suspicious amount of space between the symbols, as if the artist wasn't quite sure how many were supposed to go in. Inside the cartouche, 3 glyphs: a sun disk, a water ripple, and a bird that might be a duck or a poorly drawn vulture. Historians still argue whether this was meant to be a reference to Neferkara Nebi, or Nikare, or maybe someone else entirely. Or maybe it was just a trainee scribe practicing on a scrap before committing to something more permanent. Imagine your royal legacy being confused with homework. What makes this period especially sleep-worthy, besides its uncanny ability to confuse experts, is the sheer vagueness of its record-keeping. There are names that appear only once, like literally once, a single seal impression, a lone reference in the Turin King list, or a mention scratched into the side of a noble's tomb as if in passing, oh yes, and during the reign of King, that guy. There's Itai or Iti, a name that flickers in and out of fragments like a whisper you're not sure you actually heard. One document links him to Memphis. Another suggests he might have ruled in Heracleopolis. One daring theory claims he might not have ruled at all, that he was just a post-it note of a name used by later scribes to fill in the gaps when they couldn't agree on who was next. And that's where it gets fun. Historians still argue whether some of these names are duplicates, clerical errors, or outright inventions. Like Nikare and Neferkare, are they separate people? Or the same guy just spelled differently by sleepy scribes with too much ink and too few facts? It's Egypt's version of the John Smith problem, only with more jackal gods and fewer bowling alleys. You find another stone slab upright and tilting slightly. This one's better preserved. The cartouche is deeper, the symbols cleaner. It says, "Beloved of Ra," followed by what looks like, "He who brings order to the south." Grand, confident, and completely anonymous. There's no name in the cartouche, just an empty oval, like a fancy name tag no one ever filled in. You can practically hear the stonemason sighing. Look, I'll do the flourish later, once we're sure who's ruling. This absence of identity doesn't mean nothing was happening. On the contrary, the 7th dynasty may have been buzzing with activity, just not the kind that left clear records. There's evidence of small-scale temple repairs, scattered administrative decrees, and regional governors issuing orders under whatever king seemed to be trending that week. It was governance by guesswork. A quirky tidbit at Saqqara, archaeologists found a block that appears to contain two overlapping cartouches, one chiseled neatly, the other awkwardly layered on top. Like someone came in later and went, "Actually, scratch that, this guy's in charge now." It's the ancient Egyptian version of editing your resume with a chisel. And then there's the famous fragment of a seal that might bear the name of Menkaure. Just one seal. No pyramid, no temple, not even a statue with a nose. Just a tiny object the size of a fig. Some scholars embrace it, others roll their eyes. It could be real, they say, or it could be someone's lunch stamp. You never really know. What's interesting is how even these shaky remnants have their defenders. Entire scholarly papers have been written arguing that a single chipped stone proves the legitimacy of a reign. Historians still argue whether these pharaohs were actual rulers or just ceremonial placeholders. And some delightfully eccentric researchers believe that the 7th dynasty was a bureaucratic illusion, a string of names generated to maintain the illusion of continuity in a kingdom that was falling apart. You pause beside a half-collapsed doorway. Faint reliefs still cling to its sides, nothing grand, just a line of hieroglyphs ending in a jagged break. One of them includes a bird, a reed, and a seated man. It might be a name, or a proverb, or maybe a warning about not trusting goats. The ambiguity is half the charm. You imagine being a priest during this time. Every week a new name shows up on the scroll. Who's this, you ask? The new king, someone mumbles. Didn't he just get here? Yes, he's gone now. This is another one. You sigh, erase the previous title from your prayer script, and start again. This wasn't a period of grand wars or sweeping cultural shifts. It was a time of scrambling, a time of holding on, a dynasty composed not of remembered kings, but of the echo of kings, of names without stories, of stories without names. But maybe that's why it's so soothing. There's no pressure to memorize anything, no grand historical test to study for, just a desert filled with half-thoughts, fading names, and incomplete cartouches. A history that invites you not to learn, but to drift. As you lean back against a sun-warmed boulder, watching the horizon blur in the heat, you realize this dynasty is perfect for bedtime. It's the historical equivalent of background music. Muted, gentle, forgotten not because it failed, but because it passed so softly through time, even time itself didn't notice. And that might be the most pharaonic thing of all. The breeze picks up as you follow a line of uneven stones leading you towards the faint remains of a temple complex. Nothing towering or dramatic, just a collection of sun-baked walls, some chest-high, others fully collapsed into dignified piles. You walk quietly between them, your sandals scuffing up small swirls of dust. And then you see it etched into a surviving block, the name Snefru. Not that Snefru, of course. Not the pyramid-building Old Kingdom legend with the bent pyramid and the red pyramid and a place in every schoolchild's textbook. This is someone mentioning Snefru, quoting him, borrowing his name like a signature on a job application. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate tribute, a political maneuver, or just a case of recycled stone. But there it is, a monarch from the 7th dynasty, whoever he was, clinging to the memory of a pharaoh long dead, hoping a bit of that ancient glory might rub off. It's not the only one. You pass another fragment, this one bearing the phrase, "Beloved of Snefru." Could be a personal motto. Could be someone's attempt to claim divine lineage. Or maybe the stone was part of an old pyramid storage closet, repurposed by someone who liked the aesthetic. Either way, the message is clear. When in doubt, name drop. You picture a frazzled court official advising a new pharaoh. You want people to take you seriously. Say you're descended from Snefru. Everyone loves Snefru. You've got no pyramid. Doesn't matter. Just gesture vaguely at some rubble and say it was your grandfather's summer palace. This is how the 7th Dynasty seems to have survived, not through monuments or military campaigns, but through mimicry. Echoes, imitation passed off as legitimacy. You can almost hear a royal decree being drafted, henceforth I shall be known as the rebuilder of Snefru's glory. And somewhere a priest scribbles it down, while mouthing the words, good luck with that. You step into what remains of a ceremonial hall. The layout is familiar, columns, altars, even a faded offering table, but the inscriptions are confused. One column mentions Neferkare, another praises Snefru. A third simply says, he who walks in Ma'at, with no name at all. It's like each piece was made for a different story and mashed together in post-production. That's the flavor of this period cobbled together grandeur. The facade of kingship assembled from leftover parts of better times. Think of it as the ancient version of Fake It, till you make it only with more jackal-headed gods and less linked in. A quirky little detail you come across, a stela carved with what appears to be a festival calendar. There's a date circled figuratively, not literally, with the words, Feast of Snefru's Strength. The problem, the date's a few hundred years too late. Snefru had been dead and entombed for generations, and yet someone still threw a party in his name. Maybe they wore festival garb. Maybe someone baked honey cakes. Maybe it was just an excuse to celebrate something. Historians still debate whether this sort of homage was symbolic or strategic. Were these kings trying to align themselves with divine order by invoking older names? Or was it simply desperation dressed in tradition? One theory, fringe, but poetic, suggests that invoking Snefru was less about politics and more about stability. If people remembered his name, maybe they'd pretend the current ruler had something in common with him, even if all they shared was a fondness for falcon motifs. You stroll past the base of a statue toppled long ago. The torso and head are missing, but the foot remains planted with surprising confidence on a carved plinth. The caption below reads, "He who restores the balance." There's no name, but beside it, scrawled almost like graffiti, is a single word, Snefru. And now the scholars can't agree. Was this foot from the Old Kingdom? Or did a later pharaoh sculpt it in homage? Or better yet, did a later king carve his own name, realize no one cared, and swap in Snefru's instead? You keep seeing signs of this pattern. Later, kings looking backward instead of forward, hoping that by associating with the past, they could claim a place in the future. You pass another wall fragment with a bold inscription, in the tradition of Snefru. No pharaoh's name, just an idea, a brand, a wish. It reminds you of someone wearing a crown made of cardboard, walking around saying, "Look, I'm royalty too." And for a moment, people believe it. Or at least they nod politely and don't say otherwise. In many ways, the 7th Dynasty feels like the historical version of that nod. A polite, "Yes, yes, of course, you're king," whispered by officials who know better, but don't want the hassle of a revolt. You picture a young ruler clutching a staff too big for him, reciting oaths from a scroll. He doesn't understand, surrounded by advisors, more focused on managing the temple grain storage than on grand proclamations. And through all of it, Snefru's name lingers. Not because it belongs there, but because it gives shape to the void. Like a familiar tune hummed to keep fear at bay. You pass a carving of Ra in his solar bark sailing through the underworld. At his side is a figure labeled Servant of Snefru. No crown, no regalia. Just a quiet presence in the company of gods. Maybe that's all these forgotten kings ever wanted to be seen as part of something bigger than themselves, even if they had to borrow their way in. The breeze picks up, curling past the stones and fluttering the edges of a papyrus scroll someone left in your imagination. On it, lists of kings half written, half crossed out. Names that were tried on like shoes and discarded when they didn't fit. and at the bottom, circled for emphasis, Snefru. Again, it's both tragic and funny. These rulers, barely remembered in their own time, tried to graft themselves onto greatness like ivy climbing a pillar. And while none of their names remain with certainty, the attempt does. The effort to connect, the reaching, and maybe as you continue past these borrowed inscriptions and broken dedications, that's what stays with you. Not the names, not the dates, but the strangely human hope of being remembered, even if you have to borrow a better name to do it. You step over a line of sun-baked rubble, and suddenly the landscape shifts again from scattered cartouches and name-dropping to something even more charmingly tragic: reused tombs. These weren't grand resting places, carved with reverence and gold leaf. No, these were more like communal apartments for the semi-remembered dead. Welcome to the land of tombs with roommates. It starts innocently enough. You wander into what looks like a typical burial chamber, a bit worn, a bit crooked, but still recognizable. There's a lintel over the doorway, some faded paint on the walls, even a low offering table carved into one side. So far, so normal. But then you notice the names. Plural. One scratched on the far wall in tidy traditional hieroglyphs. Another scrawled hastily above the entrance like an afterthought. A third squeezed awkwardly into the ceiling beam like someone ran out of room. Historians still argue whether these were multi-tenant tombs recycled to save on costs, or simply mistake scribes assigning one burial space to a new pharaoh before double-checking who was already in there. A fringe theory, because there's always a fringe theory, suggests these tombs were reused on purpose as part of a symbolic gesture, pharaohs linking themselves to former rulers, even if they didn't know who they were. You imagine a royal tomb administrator sighing, unrolling a scroll, and saying, "Well, this one only used half the chamber. Let's squeeze the next guy in on the other wall." Inside one of these tombs, the decorative confusion is almost endearing. One wall depicts a procession of priests carrying offerings, but they abruptly stop halfway through the mural. The figures in the second half look different. Their headdresses are off. The colors shift. It's as if one artist started the job, left for lunch, and another one finished it with entirely different notes. Then there's the cartouches. In one panel, a name is proudly displayed, Menkaure, beloved of Ma'at. And then below that, another smaller cartouche, Nikare, born of Ra. Did Nikar come later? Was he a relative, or was Menkar simply erased, and Nikar inserted to overwrite him like a Pharaoh software update? It's hard to say. The evidence points every which way. But that's the delight of this sleepy dynasty. Nothing's quite complete, and everything feels like someone left the room mid-sentence. You walk deeper into a tomb corridor, where the walls shimmer faintly with stars painted in blue and gold. At least they were once blue and gold. Now they're faded to a sort of oatmeal and khaki. Still, the ceiling bears the familiar celestial patterns you've seen in grander tombs. Someone cared enough to start painting the heavens. But halfway through the chamber, the stars just stop. A patch of plain plaster sits where constellations should be. One scholar famously suggested the artist simply lost funding. Another thinks the work was paused because the tomb's occupant changed probably mid-embalming, and the new ruler had different astral preferences. It's bureaucracy with a chisel. And there's something else. Over in the corner, propped against the wall, you find a lidless sarcophagus. Granite. Smooth. Impressive. And unfinished. The inscription begins confidently with a royal title, "He who brings light to the Duat." But the name cuts off mid-glyph. It just ends, like the chisel slipped or the carver gave up. That sarcophagus might have been meant for Idi, or Intef, or someone entirely unknown. Egyptologists still argue whether this burial was interrupted, reassigned, or simply abandoned when the political winds changed. Maybe the original occupant didn't last long enough to finish commissioning it. Maybe his successor didn't want the stone to go to waste. It's all so fuzzy, it's practically soft. And yet amid the fragmentation, there are moments of intimacy. You find a stela tucked in the back chamber of one tomb, almost an afterthought. It's small, cracked, but still legible. It doesn't mention gods or eternal rulership. It says something like, "May he rest beside his beloved." No titles, no fanfare, just a quiet, almost private memory. You pause there for a long moment, imagining one of these barely remembered kings not as a ruler, but as a person. Someone who maybe wasn't destined for glory or statue-strewn legacy, but who loved and was loved. Maybe IT had a family. Maybe he liked pomegranates and couldn't stand incense. Maybe he hummed a song to himself while dressing in linen robes, preparing for a day of ceremonial duties no one would remember. One tomb bears an especially odd feature, a cartouche that was chiseled out. Not crudely, carefully, precisely, like someone went in with the full intention of removing only the name, leaving the rest of the mural intact. Some scholars say this was damnatio memoriae, a practice of erasing a pharaoh from history. Others argue it was practical recycling. New king, new name. Keep the art. You can't help but smile at the image of a stoneworker meticulously carving around every glyph but the cartouche. Like tiptoeing through wet paint to change a single word in a very long poem. And even more curious, one fragment found at Saqqara bears two different royal names on opposite ends of the same object. It's a ceremonial mace head, the kind used in ritual processions, and both ends boast inscriptions from different kings. The best guess, it was reused. The ancient equivalent of flipping a badge over and writing your new name on the back. You lean against a warm stone ledge, the wind curling around you in sleepy eddies. There's no grandeur here. No golden death masks or sweeping hieroglyphic biographies. Just fragments, repeats, overlaps. It's not a grand epic, it's a whispery remix, and still it lingers. These reused tombs, these overlapping names, these almost kings, they stayed quietly stubborn. They resisted total erasure. Maybe that's their legacy, not that they ruled powerfully, but that they ruled at all, however briefly. That even in confusion, someone thought to carve a name, even if they later erased it. You sit for a while in the dim light, watching the dust settle, thinking of names that never quite settled themselves. The kings who couldn't stay, the monuments that changed hands, the scribes who probably tossed up their hands and said, "Forget it, just leave it blank." You rise from the ledge, brushing a faint layer of sand from your robes, and begin to follow the breeze once more. It winds through a dry ravine, past craggy outcrops and sun-bleached boulders, until you stumble into something even more ephemeral than a forgotten tomb, a name with no body. Just a carving, a whisper on a wall. You stare at it for a while. A single cartouche barely legible. The oval is there, and inside it the symbols are strange. A falcon, a loaf, something that might be a bolt of cloth, or just a crack in the stone. It might be a name. Or it might be the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a doodle. Historians still argue whether these ghostly inscriptions represent actual kings, or are merely fragments left by local officials, opportunistic usurpers, or scribes trying out their penmanship. One theory proposes that in the aftermath of Pepi II's marathon reign, Egypt became so decentralized that local leaders simply decided they were kings. No coronation, no endorsement. Just a bold, "I'm in charge now," and a well-placed chisel. You can't help but imagine it's some provincial strongman looking around his town, straightening his borrowed ceremonial kilt, and declaring, "Well, someone's got to run things. Might as well be me." And with that, he grabs a stone, scratches his name in a cartouche, and hopes no one asks too many questions. The 7th Dynasty was in many ways the historical equivalent of a group project where no one shows up to the meeting, and whoever did wandered off halfway through. It's no wonder the records are a mess. One papyrus from much later refers to a ruler of this period with the name Jed. Something. That's literally how it was written. Just a few hieroglyphs followed by a space. Historians have guessed at least 3 different kings based on that fragment alone. You stop beside a heap of shattered masonry. At first, it looks like rubble. But as the sunlight shifts, you spot shallow carvings, half-formed. Faces, uncompleted names. One panel shows a pharaoh seated on a throne, but the throne isn't drawn in. The artisan started with the royal figure and seems to have given up halfway. Maybe he ran out of stone, or maybe he was waiting to see who'd still be king by the time lunch ended. There's something almost touching in the effort. Even in the foggiest corners of this forgotten dynasty, people tried. They carved. They prayed. They wrote down names that no one else would remember. And sometimes those names managed to float through time just barely. A quirky detail you come across: a cylinder seal once thought to bear the name of Nebka, a name previously associated with the Third Dynasty. But this seal, wrong date. Wrong context. Wrong everything. One Egyptologist famously declared it possibly the most misapplied royal name in Egyptian history. That's saying something. It's like finding a penny with Abraham Lincoln's face and claiming it proves he ruled during the French Revolution. But maybe the confusion is the point. Maybe the 7th Dynasty wasn't meant to make sense. Maybe it only works as a blurry chapter. A place where names dissolve, rulers blend together, and power flickers like torchlight in a drafty corridor. You keep walking and pass another rock face, this one etched with a phrase that roughly translates to "he who was in the south." Not a name, not a title, just a location. Perhaps that was enough. You imagine being a scribe in this era, desperately trying to compile an official king list. There was, Nikare, and maybe Pepisineb, then Neferkare something, the guy with the bad sandals. At some point the scribe gives up and writes many kings briefly. It's almost poetic. Historians still debate the meaning of this period. Was it chaos? Was it transition? A ceremonial smokescreen masking the real shift of power from Memphis to the rising city of Heracleopolis, where the 9th Dynasty would soon claim a firmer grip. One theory says the 7th Dynasty was never a dynasty at all, just a label invented centuries later by historians needing anything to plug the hole. And yet, here it is. Echoing through dusty inscriptions, fragmentary king lists, and the odd cartouche carved with more hope than certainty. Names like Iti Neferkare, Nebi, Nikare, Menkare, all floating in the same ambiguous soup. Were they kings, priests, temporary administrators with delusions of grandeur? Even the gods seemed unsure. You come across a broken stela with no decoration left except for one line: "He ruled in the time of the flood." That's it. No name, no dates. Just a vague claim that someone did something during a flood. That could be a poetic flourish, or it could be a bureaucratic placeholder from someone who forgot to fill in the form. And now, as the sun begins to fade behind the dunes, the wind picks up again, whispering over stones and stirring up the scent of desert sage. You sit down near the base of a toppled column and rest your hand on a stone carved with a fragment of a name, maybe Intef, or Aidi, or just the remains of a more famous name that flaked off. There's something quietly noble in this patchwork of uncertainty. The kings of the 7th Dynasty may not have built pyramids, or launched campaigns, or changed the world in obvious ways. But they existed in fragments, in footnotes, in the hesitation of scribes. And in a strange way they've endured. Not through greatness, but through mystery. Not because people remembered them, but because they couldn't quite forget. You lean back and close your eyes, letting the names swirl gently in your mind. No hierarchy, no clear order. Just drifting pharaohs like stars hidden by morning mist. And maybe that's the lesson. That sometimes history doesn't march. It meanders. It pauses. It forgets itself for a while, and that's okay. The important thing is that it keeps going, even if it has to borrow a few names along the way. Wind down 300 words. Now the light is almost gone, and the world around you softens into silhouettes. The desert cools. The stars begin their climb into the night sky, and you find yourself wrapped in a hush, so deep it feels like sleep itself. The names, the half-remembered kings, the faded cartouches, they all settle like dust on the mind. Light, quiet, barely there. You breathe slowly, deeply, and feel the rhythm of the past as a steady hum. Not loud or triumphant, but steady. A quiet persistence. Like the Nile still flowing, whether a king remembers his own name or not. In your imagination, you return to that half-carved tomb, the one with 5 names and no certainty. Maybe one of them ruled for a day, maybe one ruled for a year, maybe none of them ruled at all. But they mattered in the way that forgotten things do softly. Without demand, without insistence, you stretch out along a cool stone and your eyes begin to close. You're no longer chasing facts or timelines, just floating gently through a corridor of ancient air with the whispers of Iti Nikare and Pepiseneb all blending into one long, peaceful exhale. The sand shifts again. A breeze passes through and everything grows still. Time slows. The dynasty fades. But you're still here, and it's quiet now. You did well to come. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.